So when we look at fungal mycelia, so reminding you that that's their overall body. And remember that a mycelium is made of hypha, which are these little long strings of single cells in filaments that grow out. They come in two different kind of categories, and we can describe fungi this way. It's not always important for their phylogeny or their ancestral relationships, but it does kind of go with each group. And so the hypha are either septate or aseptate, and that has to do with the presence of these cross walls. So septate hypha are divided up by cross walls, and so they separate the nuclei. Notice there's still an opening in those walls, so that allows the movement of materials between the distinct cells. And so when these cells divide, they will divide their nuclei and then form a new cross wall, kind of like how plants divide. They separate their nuclei using mitosis and then form a new cell wall. So some fungi have these cross walls. Other fungi do not. They're called aseptate. And so again, notice here the difference is there's no cross walls dividing them. So in order to divide, they just divide their nuclei. There's no cytokinesis, so no new wall or separation of cytoplasm. So sometimes you could almost think of this as one really large cell with multiple nuclei in it. And so this is a way that many tissues can be. If you're familiar with muscle tissue at all, this is also how muscle tissue is. Okay, so aseptate means not divided by walls, and septate means divided by walls. So taking a look at reproduction in fungi, fungi can reproduce both asexually and sexually, so depending on the type of fungi. So they all can do sexual or asexual. Some can only do asexual. Okay, so some can do asexual and sexual. Others can only do asexual. When they reproduce asexually, they generally just produce a structure that gives off spores produced by mitosis. Okay, so they still make a special structure, but there's no two parents. So we can say there's not. There we go. There's not two different parents. So we'll just split off these spores, but there's no combination of two parents. And then these spores can just go out and land and germinate. And so this is going to be a good strategy for organisms that can't move, because remember, like if you can't move, you can't find a mate. So this allows fungi to reproduce even if there's not a different mycelium around to mate with. So that's why we see that all of them can carry out asexual reproduction. So conidia is one type of asexual spore. So these are conidia coming off of this specialized structure for asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction in fungi that can do it is going to involve a fertilization event, so union of gametes from two types of mycelium, so two different parents, zygote formation, so that's the fusion from the two different parents, and then meiosis. But this is going to happen in a really different way than we've seen before. So the mycelium is haploid, so the regular body of the fungi is haploid. And then gametes will meet. They're usually just hyphal branches. So if I have one mycelium here and another mycelium here, they're going to have hypha that are growing towards each other. And then you're going to get fusion in this area here. So the fusion is our zygote. And so once they've fused, they will now start to grow tissue up out of that fusion. And the tissue will have nuclei from both parents. And this tissue of the fruiting body is what's called heterokaryotic. That means multiple different nuclei. Because when I said fusion here, we only had fusion of cytoplasm, not nuclei. So the first thing that fuses is the cytoplasm, and then it divides into more cells that are maintaining multiple different nuclei. And then at some point inside of here, inside of the fruiting body, there will be a separate event that is fusion of the nuclei. The fusion of the nuclei will lead to a diploid cell that then goes through meiosis and produces haploid spores. And so the fruiting bodies are really specialized for spore production. Somewhere within the fruiting body, so in this particular type of mushroom, it's in these little structures here, the spores will be produced. The whole structure is heterokaryotic. And then the fruiting body will give off the spores in different ways. Either it's adapted for dispersal by wind or rain or animals. So some will encourage consumption. The animals will carry the spores away. Some break open in the wind. So something like a puffball is a type of mushroom that when stuff hits it, it pops open. Or they move when rain splashes against them and they splash out. This is what's called a stinkhorn, and it is adapted for dispersal by insects, and so its name kind of gives that away a little bit because it stinks. It smells really bad. So my husband brought one into the house one day and it was just like, oh my gosh, yuck, and had to put it outside. And the stinky smell attracts insects, and the insects then carry the spores around. So this is a generalized life cycle of fungi. So we see two options for the fungi. They can either go through the asexual route or the sexual route. So this is a fungi that can do both. So here's the mycelium. Remember, it's normally haploid, and something can trigger it to make spore-producing structures just through mitosis. So this is all just through mitosis. It will produce spore-producing structures and make spores. And there's no combination of parental information. So this is just copies of the parent. And then the spores, if they're germinate in the favorable conditions, they will produce new mycelium. So one mycelium can become many new mycelia in new areas. Okay, so that's the asexual cycle. It just involves mitosis, and it's always haploid. Now, if the mycelium bumps into a different mycelium, so two different mating types, so sometimes we represent them as plus and minus with fungi because there's not really like male, female parts. If the two hypha fuse, we get fusion of the cytoplasm. And so that fusion of the cytoplasm leads to cells that have two nuclei in them, or they can have multiple if it's aseptate. We'll go ahead and just look at the two nuclei. So this cell now has a fused cytoplasm, but it's maintaining separate nuclei. And the fungus will grow its fruiting body, maintaining those multiple nuclei. So that's why we call it heterokaryotic. It's maintaining those separate nuclei in every cell, okay? And then at some point in some part of the fruiting body, so here's my fruiting body. This is the tissue of the fruiting body. All of it looks like that. Then there's maybe an area, like maybe this is the gills of the mushroom. Somewhere within the gills, some of the cells will fuse their nuclei. So let's say that this is now the gills here. So that part, got those two cells there, will now fuse. And so when we have red and blue together, we're going to fuse both of those into one nuclei. And the computer doesn't really blend it, but think of it as purple, right? So we're now going to fuse those nuclei into a single nuclei, and so that's diploid tissue. So this is diploid cells now because they actually have fused nuclei. And so now that's our zygote, wherever this has happened. So this is a zygote, this is a zygote, right? Because they're now diploid. And then each one of these will now go through meiosis. So this is inside of the gills. We have multiple cells doing this. They will go through meiosis, and when they do, they will split into, oops, I'm going to go ahead and not use red here. They will split into spores that are haploid. But now because they have combinations from two parents, they're unique. So they will divide into unique spores. These spores are going to have different genetics than the original parent, so they will go and make new mycelia that are totally different from the parent mycelium. So that's the basic life cycle of sexually reproducing fungi. Now, of course, the fungi do it slightly differently, which we'll see when we look at the specific fungal phyla. And so here's an image showing some of that stuff. So remember, we have two different mycelia. And we can think of them as different mating types, positive and negative. You get fusion of the cytoplasm here. So here's the red and the blue. They're going to fuse their cytoplasm, and then they're going to start dividing by mitosis into dikaryotic or heterokaryotic mycelium. So notice the red and the blue in each cell. So that's all of this. All of this has areas where it's dikaryotic, and then in a certain area, so you'll get fusion of the nuclei now, and then meiosis. So fusion of nuclei and meiosis will then lead to these sexual spores, spores produced by sexual reproduction, that are different and then can go make new mycelia. So when fungi are producing their fruiting bodies, in many cases, right, we said they want to encourage consumption or to encourage something on it. So I mentioned the stinkhorn, which wants insects to get on it, or they're relying on wind and rain. If they're relying on wind and rain, it may be in their interest to deter consumption. And so if we look at an example like this is a fungus called ergot that grows on grain. And so it's in its interest to avoid consumption. So animals might be going through wanting to eat this grain. It does not want to be consumed. And so many fruiting bodies actually produce chemicals to prevent or deter or encourage animals to not eat it. And so we see a lot of toxins produced by fungi. So these are the poisonous mushrooms. That you may have heard of. So some of them are so poisonous, they actually can cause liver failure, and people will die if they don't get a transplant. So they can be extremely poisonous. Others of them are psychoactive or hallucinogenic, and ergot is actually one that's hallucinogenic. And so again, in nature, if an animal were to experience hallucinations or feel like they're, all kinds of weird stuff happening in their brain, they would probably not want to eat that again. Humans being a little bit different, sometimes that attracts us, but that's a different story. In nature, these are generally deterring consumption by animals, and therefore allowing the fungus to make its fruiting body and release those spores before it gets eaten.